There's nothing quite like the bond between a man and his dog, especially when that dog becomes your only companion after losing the love of your life. For Henry Talbot, his Australian Shepherd Daisy wasn't just a pet. She was family, the one constant that kept him going through the lonely days of widowhood. When strange brown lumps started covering Daisy's face overnight, Henry felt his world cracking apart all over again. The local vet had never seen anything like it. The growths were spreading fast, and Daisy was getting sicker by the hour. But when Henry asked for a very specific test, the vet's confusion turned to alarm. The results would reveal that someone had poisoned his innocent dog with a banned chemical. But who would do such a cruel thing, and why target an old man's best friend? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. The morning sun painted the farmhouse kitchen in gentle gold as Henry Talbot sat at the same oak table where he'd shared 37 years of breakfasts with Margaret. The coffee mug in his weathered hands bore the faded logo of the Environmental Protection Agency, a relic from a career he'd tried his best to forget. At 68, Henry had learned that some memories refuse to stay buried. No matter how deep you dig the hole, Daisy lay on her favorite braided rug beside the wood-burning stove, her once beautiful coat now marred by the grotesque brown growths that had appeared seemingly overnight. The lumps clustered around her muzzle and spread across her forehead like some nightmare constellation. Each time Henry looked at her, his chest tightened with the same helpless ache he'd felt watching Margaret waste away in those final months. "Easy, girl," he murmured, setting down his coffee to stroke the unaffected areas of her coat. Daisy's amber eyes, still bright with the intelligence that had made her such a remarkable companion, tracked his movement with trust so complete it broke his heart. She didn't understand why her face hurt, why the familiar world had suddenly become a place of discomfort and confusion. Henry had moved to Cedar Ridge 15 years ago, drawn by its promise of anonymity and peace. The small farming community nestled in the shadow of the Cascade Mountains offered exactly what a burned-out government scientist needed: wide open spaces, neighbors who minded their own business, and blissful distance from the political machinery of Washington, D.C. Here, he was just another retiree with a dog and a vegetable garden, not Dr. Henry Talbot, the environmental scientist whose whistleblowing had cost 3 corporations millions in cleanup fees and landed 2 executives in federal prison. The drive to Cedar Ridge Veterinary Clinic took 20 minutes along winding country roads bordered by wheat fields and dairy farms. Henry had made this trip countless times over the years for routine checkups and vaccinations, but never with the weight of dread that pressed against his ribs today. Daisy rode in her customary spot, the passenger seat, safely secured in the harness Margaret had insisted upon after reading an article about pet car safety. Dr. Sarah Chun had opened her practice in Cedar Ridge 5 years ago, fresh out of veterinary school and brimming with the kind of idealistic energy that reminded Henry of his younger self. At 32, she possessed that rare combination of technical competence and genuine compassion that made her beloved by both the animals she treated and their human companions. Her clinic occupied a converted farmhouse on the edge of town, complete with examining rooms that still retained their original hardwood floors and windows that looked out over rolling pastureland. "Mr. Talbot, bring Daisy right back to room 2, called Jessica, the young receptionist whose cheerful demeanor usually lifted Henry's spirits. Today, however, her smile faltered when she caught sight of Daisy's condition. "Oh my goodness, what happened to her face?" "That's what I'm hoping Dr. Chun can tell me," Henry replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. Dr. Chun's reaction upon seeing Daisy was immediate and concerning. Her dark eyes widened and she pulled on examination gloves with the quick, precise movements of someone who'd encountered something genuinely alarming. When did you first notice these growths, Mr. Talbot? Yesterday morning they weren't there. By evening, they covered half her face. Henry's hands trembled slightly as he lifted Daisy onto the examination table. I'd never seen anything like it. Dr. Chun's examination was thorough and gentle, her fingers probing carefully around the affected areas while Daisy submitted with patient resignation. The growths were firm and irregular, varying in size from small nodules to lumps nearly the size of golf balls. Some showed signs of ulceration, weeping a clear fluid that stained the surrounding fur. The distribution is unusual, Dr. Chun murmured, more to herself than to Henry. And the rapid onset, I've honestly never encountered anything quite like this in my practice. We need to run some tests. Henry had been dreading this moment, the point where he would have to reveal knowledge he shouldn't possess, request tests that would raise questions he wasn't prepared to answer. He cleared his throat and met Dr. Chun's concerned gaze. I'd like you to run a toxicology screen specifically for organophosphate compounds, particularly those in the GP series. The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire. Dr. Chun's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching alarm. Mr. Talbot, those are very specialized tests. GP compounds. We're talking about chemical warfare agents. What aren't you telling me? The weight of 3 decades pressed down on Henry's shoulders. In his small kitchen that morning, he'd hoped against reason that Daisy's condition might have some innocent explanation, an allergic reaction, a bacterial infection, anything that wouldn't require him to dust off the ghosts of his former life. But the pattern of the growths, their rapid development, and the way they clustered around Daisy's most sensitive facial tissues all pointed to deliberate chemical exposure. I used to work for the EPA, Henry said finally. Before I retired, I specialized in environmental contamination, particularly sites where military or industrial chemicals had been improperly disposed of. What I'm seeing on Daisy's face, it's consistent with exposure to certain banned substances. Dr. Chun leaned back against the examination room counter, processing this information. You think someone deliberately poisoned your dog with a chemical weapon? I hope I'm wrong, Henry said, though his tone suggested he doubted it. But if I'm right, time is critical. These compounds can cause systemic organ failure within days of exposure. The next few hours passed in a blur of blood draws, tissue samples, and anxious waiting. Dr. Chun had contacts at the State Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory who could rush the specialized tests Henry requested, though she warned that results wouldn't be available until the following day at the earliest. Henry left Daisy at the clinic for observation, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this might be the beginning of something far worse than either of them yet realized. Driving home through the peaceful countryside, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching his every move. It was a paranoia born of experience, honed during years of investigating cover-ups and corporate malfeasance. The people he'd crossed in his government career were not the type to forgive or forget, and they possessed resources that could reach into even the quietest corners of rural America. His farmhouse sat on 12 acres at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by Douglas firs and bounded on one side by a creek that had never run dry in all his years there. Margaret had loved the isolation, often saying it felt like their own private world. Now, as Henry pulled into his driveway, that same isolation felt less like sanctuary and more like vulnerability. Inside the house, the silence pressed against him with almost physical weight. No gentle snoring from Daisy's corner, no soft clicking of her nails on the hardwood floors as she followed him from room to room. Henry found himself in his study, staring at a photograph on the mantel that showed him and Margaret at his retirement party from the EPA. They were both laughing at something just outside the camera's frame, their faces bright with the promise of the peaceful years ahead. Behind that photograph, hidden in a manila envelope he hadn't opened in a decade, lay documents he'd hoped never to see again. Insurance policies of a sort, copies of reports, soil samples, correspondence that detailed a cover-up so extensive it reached from corporate boardrooms to the highest levels of government. Henry had kept these materials not out of any lingering desire for justice, but as protection against the possibility that his past might someday catch up with him. As evening shadows lengthened across his property, Henry made himself a simple dinner he didn't taste and tried to convince himself that Daisy's condition was an isolated incident, a cruel coincidence that would resolve itself with proper veterinary care. But in his heart, he knew better. The pattern was too familiar, too consistent with cases he'd investigated decades ago. Someone was sending him a message, and they'd chosen to deliver it through the one thing in the world he couldn't bear to lose. The phone rang at exactly 9 o'clock, its shrill tone cutting through the evening quiet like a blade. Henry let it ring 4 times before answering, his hand steady despite the ice forming in his veins. "Hello, Henry." The voice was electronically distorted, deliberately altered to mask its identity. "I trust you've had time to consider your dog's condition." "Who is this?" "Someone who remembers your work with the EPA. You made quite a reputation for yourself, didn't you? Always digging where you shouldn't, asking questions no one wanted answered." Henry's grip tightened on the receiver. "What do you want?" "Your silence. Permanent silence. There are certain matters from your government days that are better left undisturbed. Continue investigating your dog's illness, and you'll discover that what happened to Daisy was just the beginning." The line went dead, leaving Henry staring at the phone in his hand as if it had become a serpent. Outside, the peaceful sounds of the countryside crickets, the distant lowing of cattle, wind through the fir trees, continued unchanged. But inside his farmhouse, everything had shifted. The past he'd tried so hard to escape had found him at last, and this time, it wasn't coming for him alone. Henry set the phone back in its cradle and walked to the window that looked out over his property. Somewhere in the darkness beyond his porch light, forces were moving that he'd hoped never again. Tomorrow, Dr. Chen's tests would confirm what he already knew in his bones, that Daisy had been poisoned with a substance that shouldn't exist outside of military laboratories by people who possess the resources and ruthlessness to turn an innocent animal into a weapon of intimidation. He thought of Margaret, of the quiet life they'd built together in this place, of the peace he'd found in tending his garden and watching the seasons change. All of that was about to be torn away, replaced by the familiar landscape of corporate corruption and government cover-ups that had defined the most dangerous years of his career. But this time, they'd made one critical miscalculation. In trying to use Daisy to control him, they'd chosen to threaten the one thing that could transform a tired old scientist into something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose. Henry slept fitfully that night, his dreams haunted by images of Margaret lying in her hospital bed, tubes and monitors surrounding her like mechanical vultures. He woke before dawn with the taste of regret thick in his mouth and the echo of that distorted voice still ringing in his ears. By the time the sun crested the mountains, he was already dressed and making coffee with hands that shook only slightly. The call from Dr. Chen came at 8:17 a.m. "Mr. Talbot, I need you to come to the clinic immediately and bring any documentation you might have regarding your previous work with chemical contaminants." Her voice carried an edge he'd never heard before, a mixture of professional concern and barely contained alarm that made his stomach clench. "The test came back? Please just come. We need to talk in person." The drive to Cedar Ridge Veterinary Clinic passed in a blur of autumn countryside, golden fields stretching toward mountains shrouded in morning mist. Henry had brought the manila envelope from behind Margaret's photograph, its contents representing 30 years of careful documentation, and they evidence that had once made him the most dangerous environmental scientist in the Pacific Northwest. Dr. Chen met him at the clinic's front door, her usually neat appearance disheveled, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she'd slept as poorly as he had. "How is Daisy?" he asked immediately. "Stable, but not improving. The growths have continued to spread, and we're seeing signs of systemic toxicity. But that's not why I called you here urgently." She led him to her office, a small room behind the examination areas filled with veterinary journals and continuing education certificates. On her desk lay a printout that she handed to him with trembling fingers. Henry scanned the toxicology report, his years of experience allowing him to parse the technical language with grim efficiency. The presence of GP-class organophosphate compounds was confirmed, but what made his blood run cold was the specific variant identified, VX derivative compound, molecular signature consistent with samples from Project Blackwater. "You know what this is, don't you?" Dr. Chen's voice was quiet, but her eyes burned with an intensity that reminded him of himself at her age, when injustice could still spark righteous fury rather than weary resignation. Henry set the report down carefully, as if it might detonate. Project Blackwater was a classified military research program from the 1970s and 80s. They were developing chemical agents for potential deployment, testing them at sites across the country. I spent 2 years of my career trying to clean up just one of those sites. And where was that site? 40 miles north of here. The old Meridian testing facility. Dr. Chen leaned back in her chair, processing this information. Someone has access to chemicals from a 40-year-old military program, and they use them to poison your dog. This isn't just about silencing you, Mr. Talbot. This is about covering up something much larger. Henry opened the manila envelope with the careful movements of a man handling explosives. Inside were photocopied documents, soil analysis reports, correspondence between government agencies, and a series of photographs showing contaminated groundwater and dead livestock. At the bottom of the stack lay a partially redacted military document marked Classified Project Blackwater Disposal Protocols. "I kept these as insurance," Henry said, spreading the papers across Dr. Chen's desk. The official story was that all Blackwater materials were safely disposed of when the program ended in 1987, but I found evidence that Meridian Industries, the defense contractor that ran the testing facility, had been illegally dumping waste products into groundwater supplies for years. Dr. Chen picked up one of the photographs, a stark image of cattle lying dead beside a contaminated water source. "What happened when you reported this?" "I spent 3 years fighting corporate lawyers and government bureaucrats. Eventually, we won. Meridian was fined. 2 executives went to prison, and the site was supposed to be completely remediated. But the company fought to clean up every step of the way, claiming financial hardship. And now?" Henry's expression darkened. "Now someone with access to Blackwater compounds is sending me a message. The question is whether they're rogue actors using old stockpiles or if the cleanup was never completed." A soft knock on the office door interrupted their conversation. Jessica, the receptionist, peered in nervously. "Dr. Chen? There's a Sheriff Bradley here to see you both." Sheriff Tom Bradley had been Henry's friend for over a decade, ever since Henry had helped organize a community fundraiser when Bradley's wife was diagnosed with breast cancer. A man in his early 50s with graying hair and weathered features. Of someone who'd spent his life outdoors, Bradley had always projected an aura of steady competence that made him popular with Cedar Ridge's residents. Today, however, something was different. Bradley's usual easy smile seemed forced, and he avoided direct eye contact as he entered Dr. Chen's office. "Henry, Sarah, I heard there was some concern about Daisy's condition. How did you hear about that?" Dr. Chen asked, her tone carefully neutral. Small town. Word travels fast. Bradley's gaze fell on the documents spread across the desk, and Henry saw something flicker in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or concern. I wanted to make sure everything was being handled properly. Chemical contamination is serious business. Henry began gathering the papers, his movements deliberate and protective. We're handling it, Tom. No need for official involvement yet. Actually, there might be. Bradley pulled a small notebook from his shirt pocket. I've had reports of several suspicious deaths in the area over the past year. Farm animals mostly. Dogs and cats in 3 different locations, all showing similar symptoms to what you described happening to Daisy. The room fell silent except for the soft humming of Dr. Chun's computer. Henry felt the familiar chill that had once warned him when investigations were turning dangerous. You think there's a pattern? Could be. Or it could be coincidence. But given your background with environmental issues, I thought you might want to know. Bradley closed his notebook and stood to leave. Just be careful, both of you. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. The phrase hit Henry like a physical blow. Those were the exact words the anonymous caller had used the night before. After Bradley left, Henry and Dr. Chun sat in stunned silence, the implications of the sheriff's visit settling around them like a toxic cloud. He knows, Dr. Chen said finally. More than that, Henry replied, his voice grim. He's involved. The question is how deeply, and whether he's part of the problem or just another victim of it. Over the next hour, they developed a plan of sorts. Dr. Chun would continue treating Daisy, while quietly reaching out to colleagues in neighboring counties to inquire about similar cases. Henry would use his contacts in federal agencies to investigate whether the Meridian site had ever been properly cleaned up. Both would proceed carefully, aware that they were now walking through a minefield laid decades ago by people with resources. Far beyond anything a small-town veterinarian and retired scientist could muster Dot as Henry prepared to leave the clinic. Dr. Chun caught his arm. Why are you trusting me with all this? You don't really know me. Henry looked through the window toward the examination room where Daisy lay sleeping, her face still swollen with the grotesque growths that served as a warning from his past. Because 30 years ago, I had to fight this battle alone. The isolation nearly broke me, and I made mistakes that cost good people their lives. I won't make those mistakes again. What mistakes? Underestimating how far they'll go to protect their secrets. Assuming that being right was enough to keep me safe. Believing that the system would eventually choose justice over profit. Henry's voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. This time, I need allies. And sometimes, Dr. Chun, you have to trust people not because you know them well, but because you recognize something in them that you can depend on. As Henry drove home that afternoon, he found himself constantly checking his mirrors, noting the vehicles behind him, cataloging the faces of people he passed on Cedar Ridge's main street. The paranoia felt both foreign and familiar, like slipping into a coat he hadn't worn in years. That evening, he made 2 phone calls. The first was to an old colleague at the EPA who owed him a favor from the Blackwater investigation. The second was to a journalist who had helped break the original Meridian industry story. Both calls were brief and carefully coded, that they set in motion a chain of inquiries that would either validate his suspicions or prove that age and isolation had finally made him paranoid. As darkness settled over his property, Henry stood at his kitchen window, looking out at the peaceful landscape that had been his sanctuary for 15 years. Somewhere beyond those rolling hills lay the abandoned Meridian testing facility, its secrets buried, but apparently not dead. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of digging them up again, knowing that this time the stakes were higher than ever. Because this time, they weren't just trying to silence him. They were using the animals he loved to do it. The morning mist clung to the headstones in Cedar Ridge Cemetery like the whispered secrets of the dead. Henry knelt beside Margaret's grave, his knees protesting against the damp earth. and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers beside her marker. These were the same purple lupins she had loved in their garden, now growing wild along the creek that bordered their property. "I should have told you more about my work," he said quietly, his words barely audible above the rustle of wind through wind. "The ancient oaks. You knew it was dangerous, but I never explained just how dangerous. Never told you about the people who would do anything to protect their secrets." Margaret's headstone bore only her name, dates, and the simple inscription, "Beloved wife and partner in all things." She had insisted on that phrase during one of their last conversations, saying she wanted people to know she had been his equal, not just his companion. Now, kneeling in the morning stillness, Henry wondered if he had been equal to hers, if he had shared enough, trusted enough, loved enough while there was still time. "Someone poisoned Daisy with chemicals from the Blackwater Project," he continued. "The same compounds I fought so hard to clean up 30 years ago. They're using her to threaten me, to keep me quiet about something they think I know." A memory surfaced unbidden Margaret in their Washington, D.C. apartment, carefully filing documents while he prepared for congressional testimony about Meridian Industries. She had read every report, organized every piece of evidence, and asked the kinds of penetrating questions that helped him refine his arguments. She'd been more than his partner. She'd been his intellectual equal and his conscience. "You always said the hardest battles were the ones worth fighting," Henry murmured. "I thought I was done fighting, but they've brought the war to our doorstep. They've hurt an innocent animal to get to me, and I can't let that stand." The drive back from the cemetery took Henry through the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, past the farmhouses and small businesses that made up the heart of their community. At Miller's hardware store, he saw old Pete Miller arranging display items on the sidewalk, the same daily ritual Henry had observed for 15 years. At the post office, Sarah Martinez was sorting mail with the methodical precision that had made her the most efficient postal worker in 3 counties. These people had become his neighbors, his friends, the closest thing to family he had after Margaret's death. The thought that his past might endanger them filled him with a cold dread that had nothing to do with the autumn weather back at his farmhouse. Henry descended into the basement for the first time in months. Here, behind boxes of Margaret's teaching materials and his own academic papers, lay the remnants of his career as an environmental investigator. File cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled with case numbers and dates spanning 3 decades of government service. The Meridian Industries files occupied 2 complete drawers. Henry pulled out folders with names that brought back the taste of old battles: site contamination analysis, wildlife mortality reports, corporate correspondence, and finally, executive criminal proceedings. The last folder contained newspaper clippings from the trials that had sent Meridian executives to federal prison, but also something more valuable: copies of documents that had never been made public. Among these papers was a soil sample, analysis dated 6 months after the supposed completion of Meridian's cleanup efforts. The readings showed contamination levels that were actually higher than before the cleanup began, suggesting that the company had simply moved contaminated soil to different parts of the site rather than properly disposing of it. Henry had planned to use this evidence to reopen the investigation, but Margaret's cancer diagnosis had intervened, and he had chosen love over justice. Now, studying the documents with eyes sharpened by 3 decades of experience, Henry saw patterns he had missed before: the signatures on corporate memos, the dates of certain decisions, the careful language used to describe disposal procedures, all pointed to a cover-up that went beyond simple regulatory non-compliance. His research was interrupted by the telephone's shrill ring. Henry hesitated before answering, remembering the previous night's threatening call, that the display showed Dr. Chun's number. "Mr. Talbot, I think you need to know about something." Her voice carried an urgency that made his pulse quicken. I've been making calls to veterinarians in surrounding counties, asking about similar cases to Daisy's. I found 3 separate incidents over the past year all involving dogs or cats with similar symptoms, all resulting in death within days of onset. Where? 2 in Riverside County, 1 in Mountain View, all within a 50-mile radius of the old Meridian site. And Mr. Talbot, all 3 animals belong to people with some connection to environmental science or government regulatory agencies. The implication hit Henry like a physical blow. This wasn't random terrorism or even targeted intimidation of him specifically. Someone was systematically eliminating people who might pose a threat to secrets buried at the Meridian site. Who were the owners? Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a retired EPA chemist; James Morrison, a former fish and wildlife inspector; and Maria Santos, a county environmental health officer. Dr. Chun's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Mr. Talbot, I think we need to consider the possibility that this isn't just about keeping you quiet. Someone is cleaning house. Henry's mind raced through the implications. If Dr. Chen was right, then Daisy's poisoning was part of a larger operation designed to eliminate anyone who might have knowledge of ongoing contamination at the Meridian site. The question was why now, after 30 years of apparent dormancy? Dr. Chen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you prepared for this to get dangerous? Because if we continue investigating, we're going to attract attention from people who have already demonstrated they're willing to harm innocent animals. They won't hesitate to escalate if they feel threatened. A silence on the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Dr. Chen finally spoke, her voice carried a resolve that reminded Henry of his younger self. Those people didn't just poison animals, Mr. Talbot. They murdered them. They turned creatures who trusted humans into weapons against their own owners. As a veterinarian, I took an oath to do no harm and to be a voice for animals who can't speak for themselves. I can't walk away from this. Then we need to be smart about it. No more phone calls about this topic. Assume all our communications are being monitored. No more discussing it at the clinic where others might overhear. And we need to consider the possibility that people we trust, people in positions of authority, might be compromised. Like Sheriff Bradley? Especially like Sheriff Bradley. His warning about letting sleeping dogs lie wasn't casual advice. It was a message. Whether he's actively involved or just scared into compliance, we can't depend on local law enforcement. After ending the call, Henry sat in his basement surrounded by the documentary evidence of a battle he had thought was won decades ago. The familiar weight of investigation settled on his shoulders like an old, uncomfortable coat. But this time felt different. This time, he wasn't fighting for abstract principles of environmental justice. He was fighting for Daisy's life and for the safety of a community that had given him peace after years of conflict. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted through the basement windows, casting long shadows across the Meridian files. Henry knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new revelations about just how deep the corruption ran. But tonight he would honor Margaret's memory by preparing for the battle ahead with the same methodical precision she had brought to their shared crusades. Because some fights, once begun, demand to be finished regardless of the cost. Dr. Chun arrived at Henry's farmhouse just after sunset, her veterinary bag in one hand and a manila folder in the other. She had parked behind his barn, away from the road, following the precautions they had agreed upon during their coded phone conversation. The October air carried the scent of wood smoke from his chimney and the earthier smell of approaching rain. "How is she?" Henry asked immediately, leading Dr. Chun into his kitchen, where warm light spilled from old-fashioned fixtures Margaret had chosen for their honey-colored warmth. "Stable, but the growths aren't responding to conventional treatment. I've been researching antidotes for organophosphate poisoning, but these compounds, they're unlike anything in the veterinary literature." She set her folder on the kitchen table beside Henry's coffee cup. However, I did find something interesting in the cases I've been investigating. The folder contained printouts from veterinary journals, photocopied case studies, and handwritten notes that showed the methodical approach of a scientist pursuing answers. Dr. Chun spread the documents across the table with the same careful precision Henry remembered from his own investigations. In each of the 3 cases I mentioned, the animals showed initial improvement after 72 hours, then rapid deterioration leading to death. But there's a pattern in the timing that suggests these weren't random poisonings. She pointed to a timeline she had constructed. Elizabeth Warren's cat died exactly 2 weeks before she was scheduled to testify at a county hearing about groundwater contamination. James Morrison's dog died 3 days before he was supposed to meet with federal investigators about wildlife kill-offs in the area. Maria Santos lost her dog the day before she planned to publish a report linking childhood asthma rates to proximity to the old Meridian site. Henry studied the timeline, his trained eye recognizing the methodical nature of the operation. Someone has been monitoring these people's activities, targeting them at moments when they pose the greatest threat to whatever secret they're protecting. Which brings us to you. What were you planning to do that might have triggered this attack on Daisy? The question hung in the air like smoke from Henry's fireplace. He had been avoiding this particular line of reasoning, but Dr. Chun's direct approach forced him to confront an uncomfortable possibility. 3 weeks ago, I received a letter from the EPA. They're conducting a 20-year follow-up review of the Meridian cleanup, and they wanted to interview me about my original investigation. And did you respond? I had planned to. I even pulled out my old files to refresh my memory before the interview. Henry's face darkened as the implications became clear. Someone knew about that letter. They knew I was preparing to talk to federal investigators again. Dr. Chun leaned back in her chair, processing this information. So we're not just dealing with people trying to keep old secrets buried. We're dealing with people who have current access to government communications, who know what investigations are planned before they happen. That narrows the field considerably. It means we're looking at either high-level corporate infiltration of federal agencies or corruption within the agencies themselves. Henry's voice carried the weariness of someone who had fought such battles before. Both scenarios suggest resources and organization far beyond what I dealt with 30 years ago. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of gravel crunching in Henry's driveway. Both froze, listening to the approaching vehicle with the heightened awareness of prey animals sensing a predator. Headlights swept across the kitchen windows as a truck pulled up to the house. Were you expecting anyone? Dr. Chun whispered. Henry shook his head, already moving toward the window to peer through the curtains. In the darkness beyond his porch light, he could make out the silhouette of Sheriff Bradley's patrol vehicle. It's Tom Bradley. This could be trouble. Dr. Chun quickly gathered her documents back into the folder while Henry went to answer the door. Bradley stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Evening, Henry. Sorry to bother you so late, but I wanted to check on how you were doing. Heard Dr. Chun's car was seen heading out this way. The casualness of the statement sent a chill through Henry's chest. Someone was watching his property, tracking the movements of people associated with him. Sarah stopped by to update me on Daisy's condition. Is there a problem, Tom? Could I come in for a minute? There are some things we need to discuss. Henry stepped aside reluctantly, leading Bradley into the kitchen where Dr. Chun sat with her folder closed and her hands folded calmly on top of it. Her composure impressed Henry. She showed no sign of the alarm he knew she must be feeling. Dr. Chun, good to see you again, Bradley said, settling his bulk into one of Margaret's antique chairs. I hope you've been careful about discussing Mr. Talbot's situation with outside parties. I'm not sure what you mean, Sheriff. I mean that sometimes well-intentioned people can cause problems by asking questions in the wrong places. Small communities like ours depend on stability, and stirring up old controversies can be harmful to everyone involved. Henry felt his patience wearing thin. Tom, if you have something to say, please say it directly. We're all adults here. Bradley's expression hardened slightly. What I have to say is this. There are forces at work in this situation that are beyond the scope of local law enforcement. Federal agencies are involved, and they've made it clear that interference will not be tolerated. For everyone's safety, it would be best if Dr. Chun focused on providing medical care to Daisy and avoided conducting any independent investigations. Is that a threat, Sheriff? Dr. Chun's voice remained steady, but her eyes flashed with anger. It's friendly advice from someone who wants to see everyone in this community remain safe and prosperous. Bradley stood to leave, but paused at the kitchen door. Henry, you've built a good life here. You've found peace after all those years of fighting battles that couldn't be won. Don't throw that away for a dog that's probably going to die anyway. The words hit Henry like a slap. After Bradley left, the kitchen felt contaminated by his presence, the air thick with implied threats and corrupted loyalties. Dr. Chun was the first to speak. He's not just compromised, he's actively working for them. The question is whether it's voluntary or if they have some kind of leverage over him. Henry poured himself a whiskey, his hands steadier than they had any right to be. In my experience, it's usually both. They find someone with vulnerabilities, financial problems, family issues, past mistakes, and they offer a combination of incentives and threats that makes cooperation seem like the only rational choice. So what do we do now? We do what every successful investigation requires. We gather evidence, we document everything, and we find allies who can't be bought or intimidated. Henry raised his glass in a mock toast. And we prepare for the possibility that things are going to get much worse before they get better. Dr. Chun pulled a small glass vial from her veterinary bag, a soil sample container that looked innocuous enough to pass casual inspection. I took this from my own property this afternoon. I want to test it for contamination, establish a baseline for comparison. If they're still dumping chemicals from the Meridian site, it has to be going somewhere. Good thinking. I still have contacts at independent laboratories who can run analyses without triggering official attention. Henry studied the young veterinarian with growing respect. You realize that once we take this step, there's no going back. They'll know we're actively investigating, and they'll escalate accordingly. They poisoned an innocent animal to threaten you. They've killed other animals to silence other people. As far as I'm concerned, they escalated first. Dr. Chun's voice carried a quiet fury that reminded Henry of his younger self before years of compromise and loss had taught him the true cost of fighting powerful enemies. Over the next hour, they developed a more detailed plan. Dr. Chun would continue treating Daisy, while secretly collecting environmental samples from locations throughout the county. Henry would use his network of former colleagues to investigate whether the Meridian site cleanup had ever been completed and to trace the current ownership of the property. Both would maintain detailed records of their activities, creating multiple copies stored in secure locations. Most importantly, they would begin reaching out to the families of the 3 people whose animals had been killed. If they could establish a pattern of intimidation and murder, they might be able to interest federal authorities who weren't compromised by local corruption. As Dr. Chun prepared to leave, she hesitated at the kitchen door. Mr. Talbot, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Your wife, Margaret, did she support your work with environmental investigations? Henry smiled for the first time in days, remembering Margaret's fierce intelligence and unwavering moral compass. She didn't just support it, she made it possible. Margaret was a high school chemistry teacher, but she understood the science behind my investigations better than most of my government colleagues. She helped me analyze data, organize evidence, even proofread congressional testimony. What would she think about what we're doing now? The question struck Henry with unexpected force. He could almost see Margaret sitting at this same kitchen table, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her graying hair pulled back in the practical bun she favored for serious work. She would have already begun organizing their evidence into logical categories, asking the penetrating questions that revealed hidden connections. She would tell us that the hardest battles are the ones most worth fighting, Henry said finally. And she would remind us that backing down in the face of intimidation only guarantees that innocent people will continue to suffer. After Dr. Chun left, Henry stood at his kitchen window, looking out at the darkness beyond his property line. Somewhere in that darkness, people were watching and planning, calculating how far they needed to go to protect secrets that should have been buried. Decades ago, they had made one critical error in judgment. They had chosen to threaten the two things he cared about most in the world: an innocent animal who trusted him completely, and the memory of a woman who had taught him that some principles were worth any sacrifice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new dangers. But tonight, for the first time since Daisy's illness began, Henry felt something besides fear and uncertainty. He felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had once made him the most effective environmental investigator in the Pacific Northwest, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you're fighting on the right side of a battle that desperately needs to be won. 3 days after Sheriff Bradley's intimidating visit, Dr. Chen's research began yielding disturbing results. She had quietly reached out to veterinarians across 5 counties, using professional networks and continuing education contacts to gather information about unusual animal deaths over the past 2 years. The pattern that emerged was both more extensive and more sophisticated than either she or Henry had initially suspected. Her findings filled a growing file that she kept locked in her office. Safe. 17 cases of rapid-onset facial growths in dogs and cats, all resulting in death within 1 week of symptom onset. The geographic distribution formed a rough circle with the abandoned Meridian testing facility at its center. But the victims weren't randomly selected. Each animal had belonged to someone with professional knowledge that could threaten ongoing cover-up operations. It's not just current environmental scientists, Dr. Chen explained during their carefully arranged meeting at Henry's farmhouse. They've been targeting retired researchers, former military personnel who worked with chemical weapons, even a journalist who covered environmental issues 20 years ago. Henry studied the map she had created, noting the methodical precision of the operation. Red pins marked confirmed cases. Yellow pins indicated suspected cases where veterinary records were incomplete or unavailable. The pattern revealed an organization with extensive surveillance capabilities and the resources to maintain operations across multiple states for at least 2 years. This level of coordination requires institutional support, Henry said grimly. We're not dealing with rogue agents or independent contractors. Someone with access to government databases has been identifying potential threats and systematically eliminating them. Which brings us to the question of who's still funding this operation and why. Dr. Chum pulled a folder from her bag. This one contained corporate financial records she had obtained through a contact at the State Environmental Agency. I've been researching Meridian Industries, and the story gets more complicated. The documents revealed that Meridian Industries had been acquired by a larger defense contractor, Titan Defense Systems, 6 months after the original criminal convictions. The acquisition had been structured as a bankruptcy purchase, allowing Titan to acquire Meridian's assets while claiming no responsibility for environmental liabilities. More interesting was Titan's current status as a primary contractor for Pentagon chemical disposal operations. They're being paid by the federal government to clean up old chemical weapons sites, Dr. Chun continued, including, according to This contract summary: final remediation of former testing facilities in the Pacific Northwest. Henry felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with the inevitable logic of a well-constructed conspiracy. So Titan acquired Meridian's contaminated properties, then received federal contracts to clean them up. But instead of actually performing the cleanup, they've been maintaining the contamination while eliminating anyone who might expose the fraud. The financial incentive is enormous. According to these documents, Titan has received over $200 million in federal cleanup contracts over the past 5 years. If investigators discovered that the work was never actually performed, the company would face criminal prosecution and civil liability that could reach into the billions. Their analysis was interrupted by the sound of Henry's telephone ringing. He had been expecting this call, a return contact from Dr. Rebecca Martinez, his former colleague at the EPA, who now worked as a senior investigator for the Environmental Crimes Unit. Martinez was one of the few people in federal service that Henry trusted completely, someone whose integrity had been tested in battles that destroyed lesser careers. "Henry, I'm glad you called, but I have to tell you that your situation has attracted some very high-level attention." Martinez's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone speaking on a line she assumed was monitored. "There are people here who would prefer that you not participate in any formal interviews regarding the Meridian investigation. Preference or instruction, Rebecca? Let's just say that your cooperation in maintaining discretion about certain aspects of your past work would be appreciated at the highest levels of the agency." Henry exchanged glances with Dr. Chun, both recognizing the implications of federal pressure being applied to discourage his participation in what should have been a routine follow-up investigation. "And if I choose not to be discreet, then I would strongly advise you to be very careful about your personal security. Some of the people involved in covering up the original Meridian situation have moved into positions of considerable influence within the defense establishment. They have resources that extend well beyond normal corporate capabilities." After ending the call, Henry and Dr. Chun sat in silence, processing the confirmation that their investigation had already drawn attention from the highest levels of government. The fact that even Rebecca Martinez felt compelled to deliver subtle warnings suggested that the conspiracy reached into agencies Henry had once trusted to serve the public interest. "We need independent verification of what's happening at the Meridian site," Henry said finally. "Official channels are compromised, but there are still ways to gather evidence if we're willing to take some risks." Dr. Chun pulled up satellite imagery on her laptop, showing the current state of the abandoned testing facility. The site occupied nearly 1,000 acres of forested land 40 miles north of Cedar Ridge, officially sealed and monitored by Titan Defense Systems under federal contract. But the satellite photos revealed recent activity vehicle tracks, temporary structures, and what appeared to be active excavation in areas that should have been permanently sealed. Someone is definitely working out there, despite official claims. "But the site is inactive," Dr. Chun observed. "The question is whether they're performing legitimate cleanup operations or continuing to hide evidence of ongoing contamination." Henry studied the images with the trained eye of someone who had investigated dozens of similar sites. Those excavation patterns, they're consistent with waste burial operations, not cleanup activities. Someone is still dumping contaminated materials at the Meridian site, probably using it as a disposal location for chemical wastes from other projects. The implications were staggering. If Henry's assessment was correct, then Titan Defense Systems was not only failing to clean up the original Meridian contamination, but actively adding to it while collecting federal payments for remediation work. The animals killed throughout the region weren't just victims of intimidation. They were sacrificed to protect a fraud that generated hundreds of millions in illegal profits. "We need to get onto that site," Dr. Chun said quietly. "That would be extremely dangerous." we'd be trespassing on federal property, and the people guarding it have already demonstrated they're willing to kill to protect their secrets. Then we need to find another way to gather evidence. Because based on what we've learned, they're not going to stop with intimidation. If they perceive us as a serious threat, they'll escalate to more direct methods. Henry walked to his kitchen window, looking out at the peaceful countryside that had been his refuge for 15 years. That peace was an illusion now, shattered by the knowledge that the same toxic forces he had fought in Washington, D.C. had followed him to this remote corner of the country. But this time, he wouldn't be fighting alone. The discovery came by accident, as many of the most important revelations in Henry's career had, while searching through Margaret's personal effects in their bedroom closet, a task he had been avoiding for the 2 years since her death. He found a manila folder tucked behind her collection of teaching awards and conference certificates. The folder was labeled in Margaret's precise handwriting, "Henry's Research Private." Inside were photocopied documents he had never seen before, organized with the methodical care that had made Margaret such an effective educator. Chemical analysis reports, correspondence with federal agencies, even transcripts of recorded conversations, all related to his original Meridian investigation, but containing information he was certain he had never shared with her. The most startling discovery was a series of soil and water samples that Margaret had apparently collected herself from locations around the Meridian site. The analysis dates showed that she had continued monitoring contamination levels for years after Henry's official investigation ended, using her chemistry background to document evidence of ongoing pollution that contradicted official cleanup reports. She was conducting her own parallel investigation, Henry murmured, sitting on their bed surrounded by the evidence of his wife's secret research. Among the papers was a letter addressed to him, sealed but never delivered. My dearest Henry, if you are reading this, then the cancer has finally won our battle, and you have discovered what I hoped you would never need to know. I continued your work at Meridian because I knew you would blame yourself if people continued to suffer from contamination you might have prevented. The numbers don't lie. My love, the cleanup was never completed, and the contamination has been spreading into groundwater supplies that serve 3 counties. I have documented everything, but I was never certain how to present this evidence without putting you in danger again. I know you think I died from random cellular malfunction, but I have reason to believe my cancer was caused by exposure to chemicals during my sampling work. If that is true, then I am not the first victim of Meridian's ongoing crimes, and I will not be the last unless someone takes action. Please be careful. Henry, the people responsible for this cover-up have resources and connections that reach into the highest levels of government, but they also have a weakness. They assume that retired scientists and small-town veterinarians pose no serious threat to their operations. Prove them wrong. All my love. Margaret. Henry read the letter 3 times before the full implications settled. In his mind, Margaret hadn't died from natural causes. She had been murdered by the same contamination she was trying to document. Her cancer was the result of deliberate exposure to carcinogens, making her another victim of the conspiracy that was now targeting Daisy. The grief that washed over him was different from anything he had experienced during the 2 years since Margaret's death. This was rage purified by love, determination crystallized by loss. The people responsible for the Meridian cover-up hadn't just killed his wife. They had stolen years of her life, while she silently fought to protect others from the same fate. Dr. Chun arrived that evening to find Henry in his kitchen. Margaret's research spread across the table like battle plans for a war that had already claimed too many casualties. Her expression shifted from professional concern to personal alarm as she read Margaret's letter. Mr. Talbot, I'm so sorry. I can't imagine how you must be feeling right now. I'm feeling like a fool, Henry said, his voice steady despite the emotional storm raging in his chest. For 2 years, I mourned Margaret's death as a tragic accident. I never suspected that she was continuing my work, never realized that her cancer might have been caused by the same chemicals I failed to clean up 30 years ago. Dr. Chun studied Margaret's soil analysis reports with the eye of someone trained to recognize patterns of contamination. These readings are extraordinary. She documented contamination levels that are actually increasing over time, indicating active dumping rather than natural dispersion from old sources, which means Titan. Defense Systems isn't just failing to clean up the original Meridian contamination, they're actively adding to it. Henry's hands trembled slightly as he organized his wife's papers. Margaret died trying to prove that, and now they're using the same chemicals to threaten Daisy. There's something else, Dr. Chun said quietly, pulling a folder from her veterinary. Dag, I received some information today that changes everything. Anonymous sources sent this to my clinic, along with a note saying I should share it with you immediately. The folder contained internal corporate memos from Titan Defense Systems, leaked documents that revealed the scope of their fraudulent operations. The company had not only failed to complete cleanup operations at 17 different sites across 6 states, but had been actively using those sites as illegal disposal locations for chemical wastes generated by their other defense contracts. The financial scale of the fraud was staggering, over $800 million in federal cleanup contracts for work that was never performed, combined with millions more in cost savings from illegal waste disposal. But what made Henry's blood run cold was a memo dated just 6 weeks earlier, discussing population management strategies for dealing with potential witnesses to their operations. Population management, Henry repeated, the euphemism carrying sinister implications. They're not just intimidating potential witnesses, they're systematically eliminating them. Dr. Chun pointed to a list of names attached to the memo. 17 individuals identified as priority concerns for their potential knowledge of Titan's operations. Henry's name appeared near the top of the list, but so did the names of all 3 animal owners whose pets had died from chemical poisoning over the past year. They're working through this list methodically, Dr. Chun observed, using animal poisoning as both intimidation and as a way to test their delivery methods before escalating to human targets. The implications were clear and terrifying. Daisy's poisoning wasn't just a warning, it was a field test for methods they planned to use against Henry and others on their target list. The people who had killed Margaret through deliberate contamination were now perfecting techniques for committing murder that would appear to be accidental or natural. We have to take this to federal authorities, Dr. Chun said. This evidence proves criminal conspiracy, fraud, and multiple homicides. Even if local law enforcement is compromised, there must be honest investigators at the federal level who would act on information this conclusive. Henry wanted to share her faith in institutional justice, but 30 years of experience with government agencies had taught him to be more cautious. The problem is that Titan has contracts with the Defense Department, the EPA, and probably other agencies we don't even know about. Their influence reaches into the same offices that would normally investigate this kind of corruption. Then what do we do? Henry looked at the photograph of Margaret on his kitchen counter, remembering her fierce determination to protect people from harm, even when it meant putting herself at risk. She had continued fighting long after he had given up, paying the ultimate price for her dedication to justice. "We prove them wrong," he said, echoing Margaret's final written words. "We gather evidence they can't ignore or suppress, and we find allies they can't intimidate or eliminate. And we make sure that Margaret's sacrifice and Daisy's suffering serves a purpose that justifies the price we've all paid." Outside, autumn darkness settled over the countryside with the quiet inevitability of approaching winter. But inside Henry's kitchen, surrounded by evidence of corporate murder and government corruption, 2 unlikely allies prepared to wage a battle that would determine whether justice was still possible in a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the innocent. The night infiltration of the Meridian testing facility required every skill Henry had learned during 30 years of investigating contaminated sites, combined with Dr. Chun's knowledge of the local terrain from her years of treating farm animals. Throughout the county, they parked Henry's truck 2 miles from the facility's perimeter, hidden in a grove of Douglas firs that provided cover from both ground observation and aerial surveillance. The autumn air carried the sharp scent of pine, needles, and the earthier smell of decomposing leaves. But underneath those natural odors, Henry detected something else, the acrid chemical tang that had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. It was the smell of improperly contained toxic waste, concentrated enough to be detectable even at this distance from the facility's core. The contamination is much worse than the official reports indicate, Henry whispered as they made their way through the forest toward the facility's outer fence. These chemical signatures suggest active dumping operations, not passive seepage from old buried waste. Dr. Chen moved with surprising grace through the underbrush, her veterinary training having taught her to navigate difficult terrain during emergency calls to remote farms. She carried a small bag of sampling equipment and a camera capable of taking photographs in low-light conditions, tools that would provide the evidence they needed to expose Titan's ongoing fraud. The facility's perimeter fence was newer and more sophisticated than Henry had expected. 12 feet of chain link topped with razor wire, with electronic sensors spaced at regular intervals. Warning signs proclaimed the area off-limits to unauthorized personnel and threatened prosecution under federal law. But what caught Henry's attention was evidence of recent vehicle traffic, tire tracks in the soft earth, flattened vegetation, and the kind of ruts left by heavy trucks carrying liquid cargo. Someone has been making regular deliveries, Dr. Chun observed, examining the track patterns with the methodical approach she applied to diagnosing animal illnesses. These tracks are fresh, probably within the past week. They found their entry point at a section of fence where a small creek flowed under the perimeter barrier. The water carried a rainbow sheen of chemical contamination, and dead fish floated among the reeds that bordered the stream. Henry's portable testing kit confirmed the presence of organophosphate compounds in concentrations that would be lethal to any living creature. The infiltration itself took 2 hours of careful movement through terrain that revealed increasing evidence of environmental devastation. Trees showed signs of chemical burn, their leaves yellowed and dropping despite the early season. Small animals that should have been abundant in such a forested area were completely absent, their absence creating an unnatural silence that made every footstep seem dangerously loud. At the facility's core, they discovered an operation that bore no resemblance to the environmental cleanup that Titan was supposedly conducting. Instead of remediation equipment, the site contained a sophisticated waste processing facility designed to concentrate and repackage toxic materials. Large storage tanks connected to a network of pipes suggested an industrial operation that had been running continuously for months or years. "This isn't cleanup," Dr. Chun whispered, photographing the facility from their concealed position behind a stand of dead trees. "This is a toxic waste processing center disguised as an environmental remediation site." Henry's portable testing equipment confirmed their worst fears. The soil samples they collected showed contamination levels hundreds of times higher than what would be expected from the original Blackwater materials. Someone was using the Meridian site as a disposal location for chemical wastes generated by multiple sources, concentrating years of accumulated toxins in a location where they would leach into groundwater serving 3 counties. But the most shocking discovery came when they reached the facility's administrative building, a trailer complex that should have been abandoned but showed clear signs of recent occupancy. Through a window, Henry could see filing cabinets, computer equipment, and wall charts that appeared to track operations across multiple locations. "We need to get inside," Henry said. "The evidence we need is in those files." "That's breaking and entering. If we're caught, they can arrest us and suppress anything we've discovered. If we don't gather that evidence, they'll continue killing innocent animals and people. Margaret died trying to document what we're seeing tonight. I won't let her sacrifice be meaningless." The administrative trailer's security was less sophisticated than the perimeter fence, suggesting that Titan relied primarily on the isolation of the site to protect their operations. Henry's government experience included training in evidence collection techniques, and within minutes, he had gained entry to the trailer without triggering any obvious alarms. Inside, they found a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. Filing cabinets contained contracts for waste disposal services from defense contractors across the western United States. Computer files detailed the systematic contamination of sites that were officially listed as cleaned up and safe. But the most damaging evidence was a personnel file that revealed the true scope of their population management. Dr. Chun gasped as she read through the surveillance reports. "Mr. Talbot, they've been monitoring us since before Daisy got sick. They know about every phone call, every meeting, every move we've made." Henry studied the surveillance photographs with growing alarm. Images of him visiting Margaret's grave, Dr. Chun arriving at his farmhouse, even pictures taken through the windows of the veterinary clinic during Daisy's treatment. But what made his blood run cold was a folder labeled "Local Assets," a list of people in Cedar Ridge who were providing information to Titan Security Operations. Sheriff Tom Bradley's name appeared at the top of the list, along with compensation. Records showing substantial monthly payments for intelligence gathering and operational support. But Bradley wasn't the only local resident cooperating with Titan. The list included the mayor, 2 county commissioners, and even Jessica, the receptionist at Dr. Chun's clinic. "We've been compromised from the beginning," Henry said, his voice heavy with the weight of betrayal. "Every conversation we've had, every plan we've made, they've known about it immediately." Dr. Chun continued photographing documents, her movements becoming increasingly urgent as the implications became clear. "If they know we're here tonight, then this could be a trap. They could be waiting for us to gather evidence before arresting. U.S. or worse." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching vehicles reached them through the trailer's thin walls. Multiple engines, moving fast, converging on their location from several directions. Henry grabbed the most critical files, while Dr. Chun finished photographing the computer screen that displayed real-time surveillance feeds from locations throughout Cedar Ridge. "They're not just watching us," she said, her voice tight with fear. "I have cameras everywhere. Main Street, the post office, your farmhouse, they've turned the entire town into a surveillance network." The approaching vehicles were close, enough now that headlight beams swept across the trailer windows. Henry stuffed documents into his jacket while Dr. Chun secured her camera equipment. They had gathered enough evidence to expose Titan's fraud and murder operations, but only if they could escape the facility alive. "There's a service road that leads to the back gate," Henry whispered, leading Dr. Chun toward the trailer's rear exit. "If we can reach the creek, we can follow it downstream to where we left the truck." But as they stepped outside, powerful floodlights illuminated the entire facility, turning night into harsh artificial day. Over loudspeakers, a voice they both recognized commanded them to stop and surrender. "Dr. Chun, Mr. Talbot, please remain where you are. You're trespassing on federal property, and you're in violation of several national security statutes." "Sheriff." Tom Bradley emerged from behind one of the storage tanks, flanked by men in tactical gear who carried weapons that looked military rather than civilian. His expression was a mixture of regret and resignation, The look of a man who had sold his integrity so gradually that he no longer remembered when it had disappeared entirely. "I'm sorry it's come to this," Bradley said, his voice carrying across the contaminated wasteland. "I tried to warn you both, tried to give you opportunities to walk away, but you wouldn't listen." Henry felt the weight of betrayal settle on his shoulders like a familiar coat. In his 30 years of investigating corruption, he had learned that the most dangerous enemies were often those who had once been allies. People whose compromises began with small moral concessions and ended with the complete abandonment of principle. But even as tactical lights blinded him and armed men moved to surround their position, Henry felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the fierce satisfaction of knowing that the truth, however dangerous, was finally within reach. The holding facility where they were taken occupied a converted warehouse on the edge of the Meridian site, its concrete walls thick enough to muffle sound and its windows painted black to prevent observation from outside. Henry and Dr. Chun were separated immediately, each placed in a small room that contained only a metal table, 2 chairs, and a kind of fluorescent lighting that made time passage impossible to judge. Henry had been in similar situations during his government career, not as a prisoner, but as an investigator interviewing suspects who had been caught in environmental crimes. The psychology of interrogation was familiar to him: isolation to increase anxiety, uncomfortable conditions to weaken resolve, and the gradual introduction of increasingly sophisticated pressure to extract cooperation or confession. What he hadn't expected was the professional courtesy with which he was treated. His captors brought him coffee in a real ceramic mug, allowed him to keep his jacket against the warehouse chill, and spoke to him with the respectful tone usually reserved for fellow professionals rather than criminal suspects. "Dr. Talbot, I apologize for the dramatic circumstances, but your recent activities have created a situation that requires immediate resolution." The speaker was a woman in her 40s, wearing a business suit that suggested corporate rather than law enforcement authority. She introduced herself as Director Patricia Chambers of Titan Defense Systems Security Operations Division. "I assume you're here to offer me a deal," Henry replied, settling into the uncomfortable chair across from her. 30 years in government service taught me to recognize when someone wants to negotiate rather than prosecute. Very perceptive. "Yes, we would prefer to resolve this situation through discussion, rather than through formal legal proceedings that might attract unwanted attention to sensitive operations." Chambers opened a thick file folder and spread its contents across the metal table. Henry recognized some of the documents copies of his original Meridian investigation reports, personnel files from his EPA career, even photographs of him with Margaret taken during happier times. But mixed among the familiar papers were others that made his stomach clench with apprehension. "Your wife was a remarkable woman," Chambers said, her voice carrying what might have been genuine sympathy. "Her independent research was quite sophisticated for someone working outside official channels. Unfortunately, she continued her investigations long past the point where they became dangerous to ongoing national security operations. You murdered her. Cancer is a terrible disease, Dr. Talbot. Environmental exposure to carcinogens affects millions of Americans every year. Margaret's death was tragic, but it wasn't intentional." Henry studied the woman across from him, noting the careful language that acknowledged facts without accepting responsibility. "But you knew her sampling work was exposing her to deadly chemicals, and you did nothing to warn her or stop her." "We monitored her activities, yes, but we assumed that someone with her scientific background would take appropriate safety precautions when handling potentially hazardous materials." The casual cruelty of the statement hit Henry like a physical blow. They had watched Margaret poison herself while documenting their crimes, treating her death as an acceptable cost of maintaining their cover-up. The grief he had carried for 2 years transformed into something harder and more focused, a determination to ensure that her sacrifice served a purpose that justified its terrible price. "What do you want from me?" Chambers pulled a prepared document from her folder, pages of legal text that Henry recognized as some form of non-disclosure agreement. "We want your cooperation in containing this situation before it escalates further. Sign this document, cease all investigation activities, and we'll arrange for Daisy to receive the best possible medical treatment. Her condition is quite treatable if addressed promptly with the appropriate antidotes. And if I refuse, then we'll be forced to conclude that you represent an ongoing security risk that requires more permanent resolution." The threat was delivered with the same professional courtesy that had characterized their entire conversation, making it somehow more chilling than if it had been shouted or accompanied by physical intimidation. These people killed with the methodical efficiency of accountants, calculating tax liabilities. Henry pretended to study the non-disclosure agreement while actually examining the room for potential advantages. The fluorescent lights created shadows that might conceal small recording devices. The ventilation system sounded powerful enough to mask conversation if someone spoke directly beneath the air return. Most importantly, the door showed signs of electronic locking that suggested remote operation rather than a key-based system. "I need to know that Dr. Chun is safe before I agree to anything," he said finally. "Dr. Chun is being offered a similar arrangement. Her cooperation would be valuable to our ongoing operations, given her position in the local veterinary community and her access to environmental monitoring opportunities." The implication was clear. They wanted to recruit Dr. Chun as an asset, using her veterinary practice as a cover for monitoring potential threats to their operations. The thought of the young veterinarian being forced to betray her principles to protect her life made Henry's resolve even stronger. "I want to see her before I make any decisions." Chambers nodded to someone Henry couldn't see, and within minutes Dr. Chun was escorted into the room. Her composure impressed him despite obvious stress. She maintained the calm professionalism that had made her such an effective partner in their investigation. "Are you all right?" Henry asked immediately. "Physically, yes." "They've been very polite," Dr. Chun replied, but her eyes conveyed a different message. As she settled into the chair beside him, she palmed something small into his hand, a memory card from her camera, apparently overlooked during their initial search. Chambers observed their interaction with the detached interest of a scientist studying specimens. "Now that you're both here, we can discuss the terms of your cooperation more efficiently. Dr. Chun, your veterinary practice is well positioned to monitor environmental conditions throughout the region. We would appreciate your assistance in identifying potential problems before they become public health concerns." "You want me to spy on my own community?" Dr. Chun said flatly. "We want you to serve as an early warning system for issues that might require our intervention. In exchange, we'll ensure that your practice receives priority consideration for federal grants and research opportunities. We can be very generous to partners who understand the importance of discretion." Henry felt the memory card's edges through his pocket while maintaining a neutral expression. Whatever evidence Dr. Chun had managed to preserve could be crucial to exposing Titan's operations, but only if they could escape their current situation with the information intact. "Before we agree to anything, I want to understand the full scope of what you're asking us to cover up," Henry said. "The documents we saw tonight suggest operations far beyond the original Meridian contamination." Chambers considered this request, apparently weighing the strategic value of providing information against the risk of revealing too much. Titan Defense Systems has contracts to dispose of chemical wastes from 17 military installations across 6 states. Rather than transporting these materials to expensive licensed disposal facilities, we've been concentrating them at former testing sites like Meridian. where environmental damage was already documented. You're using old contamination sites as cover for new dumping operations, Dr. Chun said, her voice filled with disgusted comprehension. We're providing cost-effective solutions for environmental challenges that would otherwise consume billions in taxpayer funds. The alternative to our operations would be dramatic increases in defense spending or the abandonment of crucial research programs. Henry recognized the familiar logic of institutional corruption. Noble ends used to justify increasingly ignoble means until the original purpose became completely subverted. And the people whose animals you've been killing, what noble purpose does that serve? Population management is an unfortunate necessity when dealing with individuals who might compromise sensitive operations. We prefer non-lethal intimidation, but some situations require more definitive responses. The casual admission of murder delivered in bureaucratic language sparked something dangerous in Henry's chest. These people had killed Margaret, poisoned the Daisy, and murdered innocent animals throughout the region, all while justifying their actions as necessary for national security. I need time to consider your offer, Henry said, forcing his voice to remain steady. Of course, but understand that time is a luxury we can't provide indefinitely. Other stakeholders are becoming impatient with the lack of resolution to this situation, and they favor more direct approaches to problem solving. Chambers left them alone in the room, but Henry was certain their conversation was being recorded and analyzed by security personnel trained to detect deception and resistance. He had perhaps minutes to communicate with Dr. Chun before their captors returned with demands for immediate compliance. The emergency kit in your veterinary bag, he said quietly, remembering the medical supplies she carried for treating poisoned animals. Do you have anything that could neutralize organ office fake compounds? Atropine and pralidoxime standard antidotes for pesticide poisoning. But Mr. Talbot, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, the ventilation system in this building is drawing air from the main facility. If they're processing chemical wastes as actively as the evidence suggests, there should be trace contamination in the air supply. Henry's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. People who work with these compounds regularly develop tolerance to low-level exposure, but they're not immune to concentrated doses. Dr. Chun's eyes widened as she understood his implication. The emergency medical kit that was standard equipment for rural veterinarians contained exactly the chemicals needed to create a distraction that could level the playing field between captives and captors. That's incredibly dangerous. We could kill innocent people, security guards who are just doing their jobs. Those security guards are complicit in murder operations that have claimed at least 20 victims that we know about. And if we don't act, we'll become victims 21 and 22. Henry met her gaze steadily. Margaret spent her final years fighting the same battle because she believed that some principles are worth any personal cost. I failed her by walking away from that fight once. I won't fail her again. The sound of returning footsteps echoed through the warehouse, accompanied by voices discussing final resolution protocols and site sterilization procedures. Whatever patience Titan's leadership had shown for negotiation was apparently exhausted. Dr. Chun opened her veterinary bag and began preparing compounds with the swift precision of someone who had spent years mixing emergency medications under pressure. If we're going to do this, we need to time it perfectly. One chance, no mistakes. Henry nodded, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once made him effective in high-stakes confrontations with corporate criminals. But this time, the stakes were higher than career advancement or regulatory compliance. This time, they were fighting for the right to expose the truth about crimes that reached from isolated chemical dumping sites to the corridors of federal power. Outside the warehouse, the contaminated landscape of the Meridian facility stretched toward mountains that had once represented peace and sanctuary. Soon, those same mountains would either shelter their escape or witness their final defeat in a battle that had begun 30 years ago with one man's refusal to ignore evidence of environmental crimes. Either way, the fight would end tonight. The confrontation began when Director Chambers returned with two security contractors whose tactical gear and weapons suggested military rather than corporate backgrounds. The fluorescent lights in the interrogation room cast harsh shadows that made everyone's face appear skull-like, fitting ambience for a conversation about life and death. Dr. Talbot, our patience with diplomatic solutions has been exhausted, Chambers announced, setting a briefcase on the metal table between them. You and Dr. Chun have gathered evidence that could compromise operations essential to national security. We need that evidence surrendered and your commitment to permanent silence. Henry studied the security contractors flanking Chambers, noting their positioning and equipment with the analytical approach that had served him well during dangerous investigations. Both men carried sidearms and communication devices, but their body language suggested they were more comfortable with intimidation than actual violence. Before I agree to anything, I want to understand exactly what happened to my wife, Henry said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. Margaret's letter suggested she believed her cancer was caused by chemical exposure during her research. Was her death intentional? Chambers opened the briefcase, revealing rows of document folders organized with bureaucratic precision. Your wife's death was an unfortunate consequence of her unauthorized investigation activities. She was warned multiple times about the dangers of collecting soil samples from contaminated areas without proper safety equipment. Warned by whom? Sheriff Bradley delivered several verbal warnings over the course of Margaret's research. When those warnings were ignored, we were forced to allow natural consequences to take their course. The admission hit Henry like a physical blow. Bradley had known that Margaret was exposing herself to deadly chemicals, had been ordered to warn her about the dangers, but had allowed her to continue her work, knowing it would eventually kill her. The betrayal was more complete than Henry had imagined possible. Dr. Chun's reaction was immediate and visceral. You let her poison herself. Rather than stopping her research directly, you turned her own dedication against her, used her scientific curiosity as a weapon. Dr. Chun, your emotional response is understandable but counterproductive. Chambers replied with the detached tone of someone discussing statistical probabilities rather than human suffering. Margaret Talbot chose to continue activities that posed risks to herself and to sensitive operations. We provided warnings through appropriate channels. Her decision to ignore those warnings was her own. Henry felt something snap inside his chest, not breaking, but clicking into place like the safety being removed from a weapon. For 30 years, he had fought corporate criminals using legal procedures and bureaucratic processes, achieving partial victories that left the underlying corruption intact. Margaret had died because he had walked away from that fight too early, accepting compromise when he should have demanded complete victory. Show me the complete files on the population management program, he said quietly. Chambers hesitated, apparently surprised by the calm reasonableness of his request. That information is classified at levels beyond your clearance, even during your federal service. Then I have nothing more to discuss with you. The standoff stretched for nearly a minute, tension building like pressure in a chemical reactor approaching critical levels. Finally, Chambers nodded to one of the security contractors, who left the room and returned with additional folders, marked with classification stamps that Henry recognized from his highest-level government work. The population management files contained details that made Henry's previous suspicions seem naive in their limited scope. Titan's operations weren't confined to environmental cover-ups. They were conducting systematic elimination of anyone who might threaten defense contract operations worth billions of dollars annually. The animal poisonings were just one tool in an arsenal that included staged accidents, induced medical emergencies, and social isolation campaigns designed to destroy careers and relationships. 17 confirmed eliminations over the past 3 years. Henry read aloud from a summary document, including Margaret Talbot, listed as environmental exposure, natural consequences of unauthorized research activity. Your wife's case was particularly elegant because it required minimal direct intervention, Chambers explained with the pride of someone describing a successful business strategy. Her own scientific training and dedication to thoroughness made her an ideal candidate for self-administered exposure to carcinogenic materials. Dr. Chun's face had gone pale with horror and rage. You're talking about murder as if it were a marketing campaign. We're talking about protecting operations that serve essential national security interests. The research conducted at facilities like Meridian contributes to defensive capabilities that protect millions of American lives. Henry felt the memory card Dr. Chun had passed him pressing against his ribs through his jacket pocket. Whatever evidence she had managed to photograph could expose the entire scope of Titan's criminal operations. But only if they could survive long enough to get that information to authorities, who weren't compromised by corporate influence. What happens to us now? He asked. That depends on your willingness to cooperate with containment protocols. Sign the non-disclosure agreements. Accept relocation assistance to a community where you can rebuild your lives away from sensitive operations. And this situation ends with everyone's interests protected. And if we refuse? Chambers closed the file folders with the finality of someone ending a negotiation. Then, we implement more definitive solutions to the security risks you represent. The choice is yours, Dr. Talbot, but it must be made tonight. As, if summoned by her words, an alarm began sounding throughout the facility, a harsh electronic wail that suggested emergency conditions requiring immediate response. Through the painted windows, Henry could see flashing lights and hear the sound of vehicles moving rapidly around the complex. One of the security contractors pressed a hand to his earpiece, listening to communications that made his expression shift from professional confidence to genuine concern. Director, we have multiple breaches at the perimeter fence. Unknown individuals with surveillance equipment, possibly federal agents. Chambers' composure cracked for the first time since Henry had met her. That's impossible. We have monitoring protocols that would detect any official investigation. But Henry was already smiling with the grim satisfaction of someone whose desperate gamble was beginning to pay off. Before infiltrating the Meridian site, he had made arrangements that Chambers and her security team apparently hadn't anticipated backup. Plans developed during 30 years of investigating people who thought they were too powerful to be held accountable for their crimes. The backup plan Henry had activated before entering the Meridian facility was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the EPA's Environmental Crimes Unit had been expecting his check-in call by midnight. When that call failed to come, she had implemented protocols they had established during their years of working together on dangerous investigations. Martinez hadn't just contacted federal law enforcement, she had reached out to Senator Patricia Williams, whose Environmental Protection Subcommittee had oversight authority for defense contractor cleanup operations. Williams, in turn, had coordinated with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit and the Defense Department's Inspector General's office to launch a coordinated investigation that bypassed all local authorities. The result was a multi-agency response that Titan's security protocols hadn't anticipated. Federal agents equipped with hazmat suits and environmental testing equipment had surrounded the facility within hours of Henry and Dr. Chun's disappearance, treating the situation as both a criminal investigation and a potential chemical disaster. Dr. Talbot, it appears your federal contacts have been more active than we anticipated, Chambers said. her professional composure cracking as reports flooded in through her security team's communications. However, this facility operates under classified defense contracts that may limit federal investigation authority. Not when those contracts involve fraud and murder, Henry replied, feeling the momentum of the situation shifting in their favor. Rebecca Martinez has been investigating defense contractor environmental crimes for 15 years. She knows how to navigate classification issues when they're being used to obstruct justice. Through the facility's communication system, they could hear federal agents coordinating their approach with the methodical precision of people who had conducted similar operations before. Environmental crime investigators brought specialized equipment for dealing with chemical contamination sites, and their procedures accounted for the possibility that suspects might attempt to destroy evidence through deliberate releases of toxic materials. Dr. Chen had been quietly preparing her veterinary chemicals while attention focused on the external crisis, following Henry's whispered instructions for creating a diversion that would give them opportunity to escape their captors. Her emergency medical kit contained everything needed to neutralize the air filtration system and create confusion among security personnel who weren't equipped with proper protective gear. Director Chambers, one of the security contractors, reported, "Federal agents are demanding immediate access to all facility records and personnel. They have warrants signed by 3 different federal judges. The carefully controlled environment that had given Titan complete dominance over the situation was dissolving into chaos as multiple agencies converged on evidence that would expose decades of criminal operations." But Henry knew that desperate criminals with access to deadly chemicals posed extreme dangers when cornered, and the facility's stockpiles of toxic materials could be weaponized against the federal agents surrounding the perimeter. "We need to warn them about the contamination levels," he told Dr. Chen quietly. "If Titan decides to destroy evidence by releasing chemicals into the environment, the response teams could be walking into a death trap." Dr. Chen nodded and activated the chemical diversion she had prepared, releasing compounds that would react with the facility's air filtration system to create harmless but alarming-looking smoke. As emergency systems activated throughout the building, she and Henry moved toward the room's exit while their captors focused on determining whether they were under chemical attack. The escape attempt succeeded partly because of careful planning, and partly because Titan's security personnel were trained to handle corporate espionage rather than coordinated federal law enforcement operations. Henry and Dr. Chen reached the facility's communications center just as Director Chambers was ordering the release of chemical stockpiles to sterilize evidence before federal agents could collect it. "You can't do that," Henry said, confronting Chambers as she prepared to activate disposal systems that would release thousands of gallons of concentrated toxins into the surrounding environment. "There are federal agents within the contamination radius. You'll be committing mass murder. We'll be protecting national security operations from unauthorized disclosure." The agents were warned to maintain safe distances from the facility perimeter. Dr. Chen moved to the communication console, using her technical knowledge to override the disposal activation sequence. "Those chemicals will contaminate groundwater supplies serving 3 counties. You're talking about poisoning thousands of people to cover up your crimes." The final confrontation lasted less than 5 minutes, but felt like hours. Chambers and her security team attempted to regain control of the disposal systems while Henry and Dr. Chen worked to prevent the release of chemicals that would turn the entire region into a toxic wasteland. Federal agents breached the facilities perimeter just as Titan's personnel made their final attempt to destroy evidence through environmental catastrophe. In the end, it was Sheriff Tom Bradley who made the crucial decision. Faced with the choice between protecting his corporate handlers and preventing the contamination of his own community, he chose to help the federal agents locate and secure the chemical storage systems before they could be weaponized. His last minute Cooperation saved thousands of lives and preserved the evidence needed to expose the full scope of Titan's criminal operations. 3 months later, the spring sunshine streaming through the windows of Cedar Ridge Veterinary Clinic illuminated a scene that would have seemed impossible during the dark days of October. Daisy lay on her favorite examining table, her beautiful Australian Shepherd coat restored to its original glossy perfection. The grotesque brown lumps, nothing more than a painful memory documented in medical photographs that now served as evidence in federal criminal proceedings. Complete recovery, Dr. Chun announced, updating Daisy's medical chart with the news Henry had been praying to hear. The antidote protocols we developed based on Titan's own research files were completely effective. Her liver function is normal. Her neurological responses are excellent, and there's no sign of permanent damage from the chemical exposure. Henry scratched behind Daisy's ears, feeling the same overwhelming relief he had experienced the day federal agents confirmed that the immediate danger to his community had been eliminated. Daisy's tail wagged with the enthusiasm of a dog who had forgotten her ordeal and focused entirely on the joy of being surrounded by people who loved her. The past 3 months had brought a parade of investigators, journalists, and congressional staff members to Cedar Ridge, transforming the quiet farming community into the center of a scandal that reached from defense contractor boardrooms to the highest levels of federal environmental agencies. The evidence Henry and Dr. Chun had gathered during their night infiltration of the Meridian facility had provided the foundation for prosecutions that would likely continue for years. Titan defense systems face criminal charges in federal court. FOR fraud, environmental crimes, and conspiracy to commit murder. Director Patricia Chambers and 14 other company executives had been arrested on charges carrying potential life sentences. The company's defense contracts had been terminated, and its assets were being liquidated to fund the largest environmental cleanup operation in Pacific Northwest history. But for Henry, the most important victory was measured not in corporate prosecutions or federal appropriations, but in the gentle weight of Daisy's head resting against his arm as Dr. Chun completed her examination. The federal cleanup teams estimate it will take 5 years to properly remediate all the sites Titan contaminated, Dr. Chun said, organizing her paperwork with the same methodical care she brought to all her professional responsibilities. But the good news is that they're using protocols based on Margaret's research notes. Her work is finally getting the recognition it deserved. Margaret's hidden investigation had provided crucial baseline data for understanding the true extent of contamination at 17 sites across 6 states. Her sacrifice had not been meaningless. Her research was now saving lives and guiding environmental restoration efforts that would protect future generations from the toxic legacy of corporate greed and government corruption. The cleanup operations had brought unexpected benefits to Cedar Ridge and surrounding communities. Federal contracts for remediation work had provided employment for dozens of local residents, and the increased environmental monitoring had led to improvements in water quality and agricultural safety that would benefit the region for decades. Tacoma Sheriff Tom Bradley's cooperation with federal investigators had earned him a reduced sentence, but it hadn't saved his career or his reputation. He had resigned from office and accepted a plea agreement that would require him to testify against former associates while serving 2 years in federal prison. His fall from grace had been swift and complete, a reminder that corruption always carries a price that must eventually be paid. Any regrets about how it all turned out? Dr. Chun asked as she packed her veterinary equipment. Henry considered the question while watching Daisy explore the examination room with the curious energy of a dog whose world had returned to being a place of safety and predictable routines. The past 3 months had been exhausting and occasionally dangerous, filled with depositions, interviews, and security precautions that reminded him daily of the powerful enemies his investigation had created. but they had also been deeply satisfying in ways he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. Working with Dr. Chun had rekindled his sense of purpose and renewed his faith in the possibility of achieving justice through persistence and courage. Their partnership had evolved from necessity into genuine friendship built on shared values and mutual respect that reminded him of his best collaborations with Margaret. "No regrets about exposing the truth," Henry said finally. "But I wish Margaret could have lived to see justice done for the crimes that killed her." "She did see it," Dr. Chun replied gently. "Through her research, through the evidence she preserved, through the letter that started you on this path. Margaret is the reason we were able to stop Titan before they killed more innocent people." That evening, Henry drove to Cedar Ridge Cemetery with Daisy riding in her customary passenger seat, both of them enjoying the peaceful countryside that had been restored to genuine rather than illusory safety. The spring air carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh grass, clean smells unmarred by the chemical contamination that had once threatened every living creature in the region. At Margaret's grave, Henry placed a new bouquet of lupins beside her headstone, these gathered from their garden where they now grew without fear of toxic soil or contaminated groundwater. Daisy settled beside him in the grass, content to share the quiet communion with memories of the woman who had loved them both. "We did it, Margaret," Henry said quietly, his words carrying across the peaceful cemetery toward mountains that no longer harbored deadly secrets. "Your research exposed our crimes, and your courage inspired me to finish the fight we started together 30 years ago." As the sun set behind the Cascade Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that Margaret had always loved, Henry felt something he hadn't experienced since her death, a sense of completion that came from knowing he had honored a memory through actions that justified the faith she had placed in him. The drive home took them past Dr. Chen's clinic, where warm lights in the windows suggested evening appointments with animals whose owners no longer needed to fear that loving their pets might make them targets for corporate revenge. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve their community. But tonight belonged to gratitude and the quiet satisfaction of battles well fought and decisively won. Some fights, Henry reflected as he pulled into his driveway, with Daisy beside him, are worth any personal cost because they protect things that matter more than individual safety or comfort. Margaret had understood that truth, and her legacy lived on in a world made safer by her sacrifice and his determination to honor it.